Okay. Private sector played a huge role in dealing with the pandemic, coming together with other funders to provide money, provide resources to local communities, gathering food together, delivering food. The pandemic really brought together a lot of people who weren't traditionally together.
Our guest for this issue is Dr. Joel Christie. He is the chairman of the Premier's Council on Charities and Civil Society. He co-authored The Nurturing Leader and Guide to Collaboration. He has over 40 years of direct senior and executive management experience and 35 years of community development experience. Joel, welcome to Kolbe Times.
Thank you. Good to see you, Bill.
I'm really excited to talk to you, not just as a friend, but as a professional, Joel. I don't know if I've told you this, but I've always admired you in your role as a professional and the work that you've done for the common good. And this, how well suited you are to chair the Council on Civil Society. Most of our audience will not have heard much about it. Can you tell me a little bit about the council, what it's about and what it's doing?
The Premier was interested in looking at, on an ongoing basis, how civil society, how at the local community level identifies needs, develops relationships, and responds to those needs. So he appointed a council of, there's 15 of us, I chair. It's a council of wisdom, really. We come together, we've been appointed, some for 2 years, some for 3 years. Identify organizations and processes that are happening at the local level that help people with their daily life and achieve whatever goals they have in mind. So this includes, in Alberta, the private sector, as well as the volunteer sector, the charity sector, recreation, community organizations, and informal groups as well that come together around a specific need.
I was quite surprised to see that it also includes faith-based organizations.
It does indeed, because faith-based organizations have a huge role in identifying and addressing local needs and issues that are at a community level.
Mm-hmm. I would agree. Now, you've just come out with a report that focuses on the issues facing women, especially coming out of COVID and here with the economic recovery. What is the council learning about the status of women in society today, and what kinds of issues they're facing and how to best to address them?
What we learned is the system was broken before, and the pandemic really emphasized or put a huge focus on what was broken. Women in particular, the various cultural groups, particularly, and indigenous communities, were having challenges in supporting not only their family but also their community and themselves. And in this pandemic, we looked at okay, how did the community come together, and how did it identify specific needs for women going forward in terms of home care, in terms of being a spouse, in terms of being a caregiver, not only for their children but also for elderly people, and having to deal with ongoing issues, family issues. Now, the family is the domestic church, and that's what civil society is about. We learn who we are in our family, and who how we relate to one another. We learn our roles and our counter roles within the domestic church, and then from there expand out to the local community and to the church as a whole. So civil society really was there to support women, but there were holes in the system. For example, childcare. Okay, there are a number. Our report showed that for women to work and still look after their children, there was no adequate daycare on an ongoing basis. Maybe 9 to 5, 5 days a week, but what about night shifts and different shifts? So what our report showed is that the pandemic in particular, really identified some holes in our support system for women.
Mm-hmm. So if we were to apply this in terms of addressing these issues, pick, say, faith-based organizations and community organizations, what can they do to make a difference?
I think they're already doing it in a lot of cases. Being open to identify needs, being open to listen to calls for help. Okay, not only providing the good news of the gospel, but bringing it forward. I recognizing the God-given talents and abilities in each person, and listening to them in terms of the situations they're going through. The pandemic also created, since women had to stay at home, look after their kids, maybe have to leave their jobs, it created a chance where domestic violence increased. And the cries for help, sometimes, particularly in rural areas and Indigenous communities, were not heard. And also recognizes that the issues and situations are going through, to see how we can provide help. And that happens at the local communities, particularly in the smaller churches, Christian and other temples and other religions are doing the same thing.
Would it be true to say that we have, as a society and in many organizations, not just faith-based organizations, look to government to take care of people? And this is in some way a response to then a return to sort of the natural role that we can play.
The role of government really should be to respond to needs identified at the community level. What we have found in the past is that it's usually funders that identify what programs they want to fund. So they're, in a sense, unbeknownst to them, identifying the needs in the community, rather than the community identifying needs and then going to funders to ask for help. So, for example, what we found out in our consultations is many organizations said they would like to be funded on outcomes rather than on programs. So, for example, for substance abuse, okay, let's try different ways of helping people deal with that issue and recover from it, rather than just a program for, on-site needles or whatever it is. Okay, rather than program funding, we should be looking at outcome funding, and that's an area we'd like to go into further. Then government could then fund part of that. There's also a lot of philanthropic people that are coming forward. Okay, private sector played a huge role in dealing with the pandemic, coming together with other funders to provide money, provide resources to local communities, preparing meals and delivering them to people who can't get out. The pandemic really brought together a lot of people who weren't traditionally together. And I really, in Alberta, I really would like to emphasize and the role the private sector played. I know of one large organization that is a energy providing organization that opened up their kitchen, their Blue Flame Kitchen, to a not-for-profit to come in, a not-for-profit organization that provides support to seniors who can no longer leave their homes. The volunteers came in, created the meal in that organization's kitchen that's really set up for another purpose, but got the meals and delivered it to the seniors. A beautiful example of seeing the need, looking at what's needed, and then just going ahead and doing it rather than a program. It wasn't a meal delivery program. It was in a response to seniors are hungry. Okay, it was an outcome that was addressed, and people just came together. United Ways also played a big purpose. They in helping create this funders table, where they asked funders, different private sector, public sector, foundations, philanthropical people, to come together and say, how can we work together to help fund organizations that are addressing specific needs that are being identified in the community? Beautiful act of civil society. Our challenge now is, as the pandemic is starts to lessen and we've been all vaccinated and it's not having its drastic effect on people and the health system, that we lose part of that and go back to just funding and programs. So I would, hopefully we can through the council keep that energy and relationship building continuing.
Very good. I was going to say that we've got some wheels in motion here. We've got momentum, ironically, because of the struggles related to the pandemic and some other issues. Now, how do we keep the wheels in motion? How do we involve people? How do we develop people in organizations and build bridges so they can operate more effectively as a result of this pandemic and other challenges?
I think that's what why the council was set up. We need a structure that'll ask the questions and a process to address those questions. And hopefully that's a structure that cuts across all boundaries and all ministries. What we found is that there are about 5 or 6 different ministries: economic development, health, rural development, transportation, as well as social services and community health, all giving different grants in isolation of each other to civil society, to building resources in the local community. They're now coming together because of the pandemic to say, how do we coordinate our resources and address the needs at the local community as identified in the local community? I think the social planning process now is a process now that we can continue to support, identify local needs, and then open it up to who can fund this. We're open for that, and we're hopefully going to create a process for that to continue.
So would you envision that there be tearing down of walls in the system? So for example, different provincial ministries or departments are allowed or encouraged to join forces rather than have these very narrow mandates as to what they can do and who they can fund.
Exactly. Like the status of women, the Associate Minister for Status of Women was developed just as our report was ready to come out. They're focusing in on women, okay, across all ministries, okay, to see how they can pull together resources to address the needs of women in the different departments. For education process, women worked from home, okay, during the pandemic, and they've now seen, how can we support women? How can we do education at home? How can we help them continue to develop? It provides a real opportunity.
Do you think there's also a role for education? The reason why I ask is the last issue, and when I was talking to Archbishop Boris Gudziak, who is the president of the Ukrainian Catholic University, he talked about how powerful it is to train leaders, to teach people who have a desire to be involved in civil society as to how to bring about that change that you're talking about.
Exactly. And I think that there were barriers for women, in particular, to advance in their education. They had, again, caregiving duties, isolation, perhaps, not being able to get out because they have responsibilities at home. That provided some barriers. Now that you can get an education using the internet. That was the other thing we identified, is that throughout the province, for example, there wasn't the same access to internet. So in the rural areas, the internet, if even available, was quite slow. And so what we found is that there's now an effort to increase the speed and the accessibility of internet throughout the province. So that's one benefit. The province is coming to acknowledge that and is supporting that project further.
I get the impression that the sort of the spirit behind this whole thing is akin to what President Kennedy said many years ago, not ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country or your province or your state.
Exactly. And that's what's happening. The pandemic had happened. Now, as jobs are becoming more readily available, even the way we do work now has changed. Downtown Calgary, even though companies are coming in, we're now looking at hybrid jobs where they spend 2 or 3 days at home as well as 2 or 3 days in the office. I saw another program on where they're bringing in their pets into the workplace. So that we're becoming much more relationship conscious, I guess I would say, okay, including animals as well as people, as well as acknowledging home life and as well as work life. There was a challenge in that when people were working at home that they didn't know how to stop work. You know, you end up 24/7 on your job because you were doing it. So that was another lesson people had to learn on how to control their work life at home.
So when we're talking about integrating people in their lives, I have to think that there is a spiritual component to it. And you made reference to, I think it's called Ubuntu. Tell me about that and how it relates to what we're talking about.
Well, Archbishop Desmond Tutu talked about Ubuntu in South Africa, which, as I understand it, is you develop your awareness in relationship to other people. Ubuntu is who am I in relationship to you, and who are you in relationship to me and to us. So to me, it's a good example of the roots of the domestic church. You know, the family, the domestic church, where we learn who we are, our strategies of dealing with issues, of dealing with each other, and how that blossoms out. And it's a very supportive concept.
Is there anything else you wanted to add, Joel, about what you're doing with the council and civil society overall?
No, I think we're now ready. We've had a round of initial round of funding of civil society organizations. We're now this year we're going to be in a listening mode to see what has been accomplished and what mechanism. One interest is what mechanisms are they using to measure outcomes? Can we create an Alberta or provincial or Canadian framework of what civil society is in Canada and in Alberta? Okay, so that we can, without the frameworks, if we can say, well, there's a good example of civil society coming to meet the needs of the people. What part of the framework does that exemplify? If we get an overall framework through research and through identifying a paradigm that makes sense, then we can start looking at where the gaps are. Okay, if there are certain gaps, we need a framework around that. So I'm really interested in looking at learning from the experience that we had, looking behind, getting the metaverse, the meta concepts of what civil society is, and so that we just don't look at specific practical programs. We look at how those programs relate to each other and into the overall framework of concepts. So I see that through a social planning process where needs are identified, social needs are identified, and then look at the local community needs and community resources to say who can help in this case, where are the gaps, and then what do we need to fill that gap, and who can help fund it. There are members in civil society, philanthropic foundations, etc., that can help fund it, businesses sometimes too, and then government can fill in the rest.
Beautiful vision. Thank you so much for taking some time to open our eyes to what we can do as members of civil society.
Thank you.